welcome to Fifth Dimensional Leadership. Today I have a really exciting guest. Let me tell you about Emilio. Emilio Diez Barroso is an investor, entrepreneur, and philanthropist who is deeply committed to alleviating suffering in the world. He's a general partner at Bold, a venture capital firm, and is a chairman of Nala Investments, a private family office with global holdings across various asset classes. He was previously managing director of Corporacion Trianggulo in Mexico City and currently sits on numerous for-profit and non-profit boards. Now here's the thing. Emilio perfected the art of appearing very successful. But up until recently, he was always trying to get somewhere other than where he was. Sound familiar, anybody? He was seeking recognition, achievement, love, success, and finally, the ultimate carrot, enlightenment. In his pursuit of enlightenment, he was forced to face what all the seeking had been trying to avoid, his own sense of unworthiness. Defeated at the game of becoming and humbled by the realization of his true nature, he recently completed his first book called The Mystery of You. Freedom is Closer Than You Think. Emilio, welcome to Fifth Dimensional Leadership.
Ginny, thank you for having me. I love you so much, and I love hearing you read my bio like that. Thank you.
Well, what a bio it is. It's so easy to read it with passion because clearly you have gone to the depths of your soul to begin to understand yourself. Before we get into all of that, I always like to ask and get oriented on where did this come from? Where did you get your start professionally and personally? Just give us an overview of some of the early years.
Yeah, I was very type A from an early age, and I grew up in a family that was quite successful and well-loved and respected in Mexico City. And that gave me a lot of additional fuel because I was always trying to do more and prove myself, especially because I had been given a relative platform, right? I always thought, well, a lot has been given, so I really have to run fast. And I ran very fast. And part of what was really difficult along my career was that I would perceive others that were like my peers when they were starting to do well. I would feel less than, and I would start comparing myself to everyone, especially because I had what I considered a head start. It felt like I was wasting time and I needed to go quicker. So I would say yes to every business venture that I could come up with. As I mentioned, I grew up in Mexico City, but I came to the States for college. And I thought I was going to go back to Mexico City, but I ended up deciding to stay in the US. And that meant starting from scratch because I had no connections, no relationships. And it was hard and it was humbling because I had to essentially figure out how to do business in a place that I was totally unfamiliar with. And most of my ventures failed, and not for lack of effort, because I really tried. Because I started really doing businesses since I was in high school. I was always very entrepreneurial. But I got a few lucky breaks in some of those businesses where I started realizing that I was actually a better investor than I was an operator. Because when I started making some money, I started investing my capital. I was like, oh, the threshold to which I'm holding the people that I'm investing in is way higher than how I tend to operate. And that was a big realization for me. Yeah.
That's an important realization and a big distinction when you think about all these startups and who's running them. They have a great idea, but they're not operators. And that's why many of them fail. And I don't know that some people ever really understand that distinction.
It's so tricky. And it's tricky as an investor, which is most of what I do, to pick
Sure.
up on those nuances, right? Because there can be a lot of passion, but there's a particular level of execution that's required for a really good operator.
Yeah,
And
for sure.
it's certainly very tricky and it's very demanding. And part of what was challenging for me as I was operating is I had this model for what a successful operator looked like in my family. And I perceived them as not necessarily being the kindest people or the most open-minded. So then my nature, which was a lot more open and receptive, felt that conflict with the idea of what a successful individual had to look like. So it almost felt like a binary choice, like, oh, I'm either going to be a good guy or I'm going to be successful. And that took quite a bit of untangling and breaking down.
Yeah. Well, it helps probably, it kind of jumping ahead. I'll just plant this little seed. That binary notion, to me, tends to go away the more aware you become that we are actually living in a non-dualistic um, realm, dimension, outside of just the world, right? And we've become so oriented toward it's you or it's me, it's left or it's right, it's and so many more options and possibilities than just those two.
Yeah. Oh, I love that you bring it right to the core of and depth of this, because it at the root of it really is that illusion of separation. Right?
Yeah.
And because with separation come identities, not identities as role, but identities as things that define who I am. And when I'm defined by all these things, and my value and my worth is attached to all these things, then I become very attached to how something shows up or doesn't show up, to how someone else looks as compared to me, or when one of those identities gets threatened. Yeah.
Indeed. So, couple questions. One, it kind of related to that. I mean, you had done everything right, quote unquote, right. You had some of the businesses eventually, right? When you kind of got started, the wife, the kids, you had all of that. And when did it hit you that something was off? Was there a defining moment when you kind of woke up and said, I'm not happy, I'm not at peace, I'm not X, fill in the blank?
Yeah. I think there were a lot of those moments, but I became really good at overriding them along the way. I became really good at finding the next thing. I would experience subtle disappointment every time I would get a win. In those sort of in that moment afterwards, it's like, now what? And I was trained to then find the next thing to go for, right? So there were a lot of moments that were really waking me up and saying, listen, it's not going to happen, right? This magic thing that you're waiting for in order to feel whole, complete, and at peace is not going to arrive through this route. At some point, I think it became really obvious, particularly when I was very successful financially and perceived as very successful by all the people that I wanted to be perceived as very successful. It's like, okay, that should do it. And when it didn't, it really startled me. And but my overachieving type A immediately found a new direction to focus on. See, this mechanism that I think we're programmed, particularly in the West, of more, right? Now found this new channel of spirituality and consciousness. It's like, okay, if I'm not going to be the wealthiest, richest, and that's not going to sort of make me feel whole, then if I go down the route of consciousness and I become so conscious, then that will do it. It was just a new direction, right? And a lot of us, when we step out of because of success or simply because of the realization that material possession is not going to do it, we will find other things to go after. More time with the family, more balanced sort of life work experiences. The reality is that until we snap out of this mechanism of right now is not enough, we'll always be seeking. And whether we upgrade our seeking to something that's more socially acceptable or not, it doesn't defeat the fact that we are actually addicted to a high that we're always chasing.
There's a word, an addiction. And addiction and spirituality don't even seem to go together, though, right? I mean, because people will say offhandedly, "Oh, I'm into this. I'm this. I'm that." Um, it, you can be addicted to that too. At what point do you find self? When does it stop? Was there a point in your evolution? I want to get into it. I want to go back, but was there a moment where you began to say now I have a better sense of who I am, not just what I have.
Yeah, yeah. A lot of the way that I approached finding out who I was through an exploration of, okay, if I'm not this, then what am I, and what am I, and what am I? And there were subtler and subtler definitions of that, right? Okay, if I'm not the sort of successful guy, then I am this, and then if I'm not this, and it became really subtle, even sort of in the spiritual context of, well,
Mm-hmm.
then I am sort of a spiritual being, or I am a soul, or I am, and as valid as all those definitions are, there was still a center that was looking to define itself through the lens of separation. I wanted to get to a place where I knew who I was, but what was a paradigm shift was recognizing that the one who was seeking wasn't itself what needed to be questioned. Right? And the realization is not that we realize, or I realized who I was, but rather the act of seeking was seen in itself as just one more expression of life. Right? This, and let me, because that can be very sort of esoteric and metaphysical, but it's almost like the way I think of it is that we relate to life and we learn to have this layer between us and the rest of life that is speaking to all the ways in which we interpret and relate to this life. And there is us and there is life, and we have opinions about it, whether we like it or we don't like it, or we want to change it or we don't want to change it. And I think we're all familiar with moments of flow or moments of being in the zone or those kinds of things. And those for me tend to be moments when this barrier or this intermediary between us and life gets really thin. And the narrator who is having opinions about what's happening tends to be really thinned out. What I could say is that there's a deep intimacy with life in the moment.
Mm.
And from that place of deep intimacy with life, then all that seeking is gone. Right? And even if the seeking comes back online, the seeker has been sort of subtly changed. Because now there's no distinction between the seeker and the thing that it's seeking.
Mm-hmm. That's deep.
Yeah. Yeah.
How long did some of this take you?
Oh, I spent a good 10 years going to
Mm-hmm.
about 8 to 12 silent retreats per year, like deep meditation, and I don't know if it was necessary, because a lot of the people that I mentor have profound realizations just by noticing the ways in which they loop around some core misunderstandings.
Mm-hmm.
I was still trying to get somewhere, and this trying to get somewhere was at the core of the illusion of separation. So when you say what happens, how do we do it? To me, the gateway is the body. Because the body is very much in the present moment. And it's always in relationship to right now. It's being told a story in the mind which operates in time, but we can always sort of recognize the value of this time paradigm, but drop into this direct experience of reality through our body.
Wow. So I want to back up just a little bit and understand how this process, how did it move you? How did you, because it doesn't happen in an instant. There's not just a hard line, I'm guessing. At least that's been my experience in seeking. I don't know that I'll ever stop seeking to have a deeper, more expansive understanding of what consciousness is, right? But I guess let me bring it back to the leadership context for just a minute. I'm real curious to know, given that so much of the reason why you went into this exploration had to do with the way in which you defined yourself in the context of business. Right? That was probably part of the problem was that you
Yeah.
defined yourself and your success by virtue of the business and how much money you made and all those things. Maybe how much admiration, adulation you got from your parents and others. But so, how did it impact you as a leader, as an investor, your interaction with other people?
Yeah. It's been dramatic. And if you had told me that it would look like it does today, 10 years ago, I would not have believed you. And that's part of the reason why I wrote the book, because I wish I had had a model for someone living from this place. Because most of the books that I was reading were written by people that didn't match my reality, right? They weren't parents. They weren't sort of in the middle of running businesses and employees and all that. So it's like, okay, great. When all of this is over, then I'll dedicate myself to this inner peace thing. Meanwhile, I'll just chip away slowly at it. I'll just meditate a little bit and I'll do this a little bit. And my invitation is now it can not only can it happen in the middle of it, but it enhances and expands your capacity to be engaged in all the things that you're engaged. And the easiest metaphor I can think of is the dream, right? It's like when we are dreaming and all of a sudden we wake up in the middle of the night and everything that seems so relevant and important all of a sudden loses that gravity. But then we're able to go back in to the dream. And it's like, oh, how do you relate to the dream when you recognize yourself as not just the character, but the whole of the dream and the dreamer in itself? It's like, wow. And what I used to think is like, well, if I recognize I'm the dreamer, then that's it, nothing matters, and I'll just sit back and life will be dandy because nothing really is relevant. And I think that's the way the ego keeps us sort of in this status quo, right? It keeps us from fully jumping off the edge. Because it's the way that like the ego likes to stay safe, and it uses fear and control as its tools.
Mm-hmm.
But when we go back into the dream with this realization, the way we lead and the way we relate to those that are around us has even more capacities online. We don't become doormats. We don't become just this big heart that just lets everything happen. We become so actively engaged, and our boundaries. I had such an issue with boundaries in the past because I was so invested in how I was seen that if I set a boundary, like, oh, are they going to stop liking me? It was that dysfunctional. Even running large businesses, it's like, that is so crazy. But when I enter back into the dream, now the boundaries just come from a place of heart and clarity. It's like, this works and this doesn't work. It means nothing about you. I have no judgments of anything about you, but this behavior or this action just fits or doesn't fit.
Mm-hmm.
And the byproduct of that is that I end up surrounded with individuals that match that, and people that want to do business with me because they feel something feels different. So all the opportunities that have come forward because of standing in this place of greater inner centeredness and freedom have been incredible.
I love that. What a great story. And it feels like, since I'm a pretty sentient being, as are you, there was a resonance with you and some of, I mean, to me, we're all energy and we all vibrate at a certain frequency. And conscious of it or not, we talk in terms, I feel your vibe. Well, there's a literal vibration, and it can give off fear, it can give off love, and many other things. I dare say that you sent out a signal of openness, a love-based openness, to attract these other entities, individuals, circumstances.
Yeah, it almost feels like a tuning fork, right? And it's vibrating at a particular frequency. And there will be things around you that will match that frequency and things that won't.
Yeah.
And I'm at a stage in my life where and I'm not suggesting that this is helpful for everyone, but I'm at a stage where I tend to get pulled to frequencies that are not resonating at the same vibration that I am. Not good, not bad, but because I can hold my frequency, which doesn't feel mine anymore, with such clarity that it almost feels like a service. It's like, I'm just going to be here fully present. And some people tell me, why do you hang out with this individual? And why do you do this? And being in the world of financial markets, there's a lot of different frequencies operating in those worlds. Mm-hmm. And it feels incredibly comfortable for me. I am no longer seeking or feeding off of those energies, because there's no longer almost like a container that is defining anything within this body-mind. Mm-hmm. And then I'm just like, there. And some people will match it, and some people won't.
But in the meantime, you're not vulnerable. In fact, in my view, you're protected by the awareness of your own frequency. Yes?
Yeah, it almost feels like absolute vulnerability.
Ah. But I guess I'm thinking, if there are people of ill intent.
Yeah.
Because there are people out there, right, who want to take advantage of you.
Yeah.
Are you not protected or aware?
I'm much more attuned to that, and that's where the boundaries come in, right? It's like, this works and this doesn't work. But where I'm not, see, for a long time I was like, oh, I'm only going to surround myself with people that uplift me, and that have frequencies like mine, and that is a very healthy stage of the process. But now it doesn't matter if someone wants to take advantage of me. I can be there and sit with them fully and still have dominion over my decisions. Now, I'm not in the middle of a sort of in the street at night in a dangerous environment where I'm physically being threatened, right? I'm not speaking of that. I'm speaking of just us as empaths, or people that have capacity to feel energetically. I don't feel like I need to protect my energy anymore. Mm-hmm. If that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. I get it. I get that.
Because I noticed that when I was protecting it, then I was still in some way controlling, still in some way holding something. My new bank account was now my level of consciousness, my level of energetic vibration. And then in comes in the egoic protector that then sort of starts creating this additional layer between us and life, saying, oh, I am better, you are not so good. And spirituality and spiritual circles are filled with people, I was there, that really hold themselves as better than. Mm-hmm. And then we just sort of we're back in the trance.
Interesting. Do you feel that there are other entities, non-physical entities, in this equation? And if so, how might you interact with them?
I don't really interact much. I think I'm aware of how much I'm not aware of, right? And yet I am also aware that there are things that I can't necessarily explain with my rational mind. And I've stopped. I live in a state of curiosity for experiencing the moment more than a state of trying to figure out the moment. Mm-hmm. So when something unexplainable arises, I allow it to be experienced fully, and I notice my mind's desire to try to understand and label and figure out, but it's no longer a priority for me. So it becomes less meaningful, not in the sense that it doesn't have value, but there's less meaning making.
Yeah. It's a little bit more of the, so what? Does that matter? Right?
Yeah. If I need to know, I'll know.
Yeah.
And I think it's so obvious how, and most of what we're saying, I think it's important, especially because I tend to be very mental. It's important to recognize this can be spoken of as woo-woo and metaphysical and spiritual, but it's very grounded, right? I mean, the idea that time doesn't exist in the way that we hold it in our linear minds is not a metaphysical concept, right? It's scientifically we can understand that, right? The fact that we're talking about energy, that's also not metaphysical. And sort of quantum mechanics has sort of opened up and blown things up and saying, oh wait, is it a particle? Is it a wave? Is it just potential? Is it? And so I invite anyone that's holding this as sort of a metaphysical woo-woo conversation to just say, just experiment it, very sort of grounded with evidence. And I used my mind to take some of those questions to the edge of where I could understand them. I got really meticulous and precise with sort of following that thread as far as I could. And then it got to a point where I had to sort of let go of it and be in silence and stillness.
Is that known as surrender?
I think that's the truest surrender, which is very different than my failed attempts at surrendering in the past. Because when I would hear, oh, just surrender, it's kind of similar to the just trust. Right? We have all these platitudes that we love, and it's like, okay, I'm going to surrender, but I'm going to have an agenda to surrender, right? And I'm going to surrender so that then all these things that I want to happen, right? Or I'm going to trust so that then it's almost like I grew up Catholic, and I would hear people say, oh, thy will be done. And the next sentence would be an agenda of how thy will should look. I was like,
it's conditional.
A very conditioned surrender, very conditioned prayer. And it's understandable, we have preferences. But when we can, to your sort of wonderful picking up of that surrender element, when we can go to that place of just deep quiet because we're like, our arms are just, and it's not too dissimilar from looking up at the stars and trying to understand our place in the universe, and all of a sudden reaching a place where the mind just goes like, hands out, that's surrender. That's like, just, I have no idea. Yeah.
Wow. That's amazing. Now, in the book, I want to get into why you did it. And I have to acknowledge the fact that you made yourself very vulnerable. You exposed a lot of your innermost feelings, beliefs, fears, all of that. And I'm curious, first of all, did that come easily for you as a function of having done the work to get to this place? Not that the work is ever done, but you got to a certain spot where this made sense.
It felt easy for me. I had hesitations at times when I was sharing stories that involved other individuals. It's like, oh, is this okay? Like, can I share things, how I was perceiving things as I was growing up? Because they involve members of my family or other things. Sure. And I checked in, and it felt true to my experience, and honoring and respecting of sort of my upbringing. So that was the only place where I was like, oh, does this feel... Because the vulnerability piece, what I've come to, I do a lot of mentoring, right? And I see such a template for us as human beings, particularly us driven human beings, for what happens. And I was seeing it over and over again. And I saw it within myself also. So the genesis of the book was really, what if we could just highlight these ways in which we sort of perpetuate our own suffering, in which we create these cycles of resistance that end up sort of causing us so much heartache. And part of that, I think, is normalizing that we are human and that we do hurt and that it is a tough journey at times. I see it as a parent. I know that as a parent, the biggest gift I can give my kids is to mess up and take responsibility and course correct.
Yeah. Well, I noted that on one of your sites you refer to your kids as teachers. And you have three, is that right?
Yeah.
Tell us
Three.
about them.
Oh, right now they're 13, 14, and 17. So I
Wow.
got three teenagers, and it's incredible. Their mother calls me the teenage whisperer because
Oh,
I
wow.
I have such beautiful relationship with them. And I think the relationship is a function of really seeing them as individual beings that are here to reflect back my own wounding. Right? My boy has been particularly good at that, especially earlier in his years, because he was very defiant, and he would sort of I would ask him to do something like, "No, I won't, and you can't make me."
Oh.
I just bubble up all of my and I was at the height of my sort of spiritual identity of the peaceful one, right? And here I was sort of meditating and in total bliss, and all of a sudden this 6 year old kid which is like and
Six.
sometimes I would find myself like holding him, physically restraining him. He's maybe even younger, 4, and like physically hurting him. And in the moment denying that I was hurting him.
Yeah.
And then afterwards he's like, "You're hurting me." It's like, "No, I'm not." And this isn't hitting, you know. What was really happening was that inside of myself, I was saying, if I dared say that to my dad, I mean, you don't know how good you have it, right? This is, you have no idea how much tolerance I have for this kind of behavior. And it would not be anywhere permitted in my household. I would get whipped. And after doing some work, I realized that because my voice had gotten squashed at such an early age, I was unconsciously saying, you don't get to have a voice, because I didn't have a voice. And when I caught on to that, I was like, oh, and the transformation from and the gratitude that his voice hadn't yet been squashed, to then say, oh wow, yes, I want to teach him how to be respectful and how to communicate in a way that is sort of sustainable and
Yeah.
kind, but I want to empower him to speak his truth and to trust himself and to make his. And then it shifted our relationship completely. And the crazy thing, and this may come as no surprise, is that the moment I truly recognized that, he stopped being defiant. And he has not been defiant once since. It's crazy. It's almost like he was there just to say, no, no, you've got a little wound here. And I'm going to poke it
Mhm.
until you tend to it. And once you've tended to it, I'll go find another wound, but that one's done for. Yeah,
But that's huge. The fact,
yeah,
and I think sometimes here to me, one of the messages is the very thing that pisses you off and just gets under your skin.
yeah.
That's the thing that you need to face, right? And you want to make it about somebody else. But all they're doing is sometimes holding up a mirror, and children are notorious for that because I think that they come here far and more enlightened than we give them credit for.
Totally. And they really, part of what happens with children, or at least happens with me with children, is that I can I can go about my life and be triggered by people or circumstances. And I can find all sorts of mechanisms to judge them or move away from them to avoid that, right? But children are here, and you can only judge them for so long before you recognize this sort of nonsense, right? So it
Yeah,
really
yeah.
forced me to say, okay, well, this is 100% mine, not 99%, 100%. And then to your point, then all of these triggers in our children and otherwise become the gateways for us to redeem the parts of us that just need attention and healing. And back to the dream analogy, when we go back into the dream, it's not like we never get triggered, but the way we get triggered now allows us to look at it with such a greater lens of compassion that we can bring our little ones and just like hold them tight and give them the love and the reassurance that they were looking for and they didn't get in the first place. And then all those misunderstandings and conclusions that we made about our worth and our value and whether we were bad or not enough, then we get to sort of balm them with this love and presence.
Now, as I'm hearing you, I'm also thinking some people might be thinking, well, it's kind of easy to love on your kids and to want the best and to change for them. But your goal in alleviating suffering in the world is bigger than just your family. And I'm reminded of the Contentment Foundation.
Mm.
Would you tell us a little bit about that? And I'm guessing that your participation in that foundation has a little bit to do with how you intend to see change in the world.
Yeah, a lot of the things that I think a lot of us as adults learn, these life skills, right? I think most of us will think back and say, "Oh, how I wish I had known about this when I was growing up. Like, why didn't somebody teach me to just listen to myself or trust myself?" Or about projections, this thing about the mirror that you were speaking of, about taking responsibility for our upsets, about ways to apply forgiveness to our judgments of ourselves and our judgments of others. And I think if we in the Contentment Foundation creates curriculum for school children and for grown-ups also and teachers that supports them in sort of bringing this into the classroom from an early age, from as young as K. And some of the curriculum includes kindergartners having full-on conversations with their emotions. It's like, "Hi, anger. Why are you here?" And then anger replying back with sometimes with drawing, sometimes with words, sometimes with, and to normalize that we feel and that we can feel so deeply and that that's okay, and not make it mean that there's something wrong or that we need to sort of suppress it and manage it and keep it, because then we're sort of in our later years, and after lots of stumbling and a lot of projecting, we find ourselves in therapy saying, "How do I do this?" And sort of the excavation of those layers is takes a bigger truck than sort of from those early ages.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think sort of back to sort of the alleviating suffering in the world, I don't have any grand ambitions. I just know how I can show up at any given moment. And I know that if I show up in that way, I can serve. And serve not in terms of, serve in the same way that when I fall down and my knee hurts, I tend to my knee. Not because I need to tend to my knee, and I don't need to hold on to the judgment that I shouldn't have fallen or it was stupid to fall or to tend to my knee. I just tend to my knee. And usually within our closest circles, our family, those people are well designed to bring up our stuff. So let's take responsibility for our upsets and own it and forgive ourselves for the judgments that we hold for ourselves. And then we will be that beacon of light that is alleviating suffering.
Well, and I don't want anyone to think, I'm going to impose my beliefs here, that you are unique because of the business and the success and all of these things. I don't think what you're talking about has anything to do with that, those material, worldly things that you have, and your ability to have and to be a light. And because imagine if everyone chose that path and everyone is standing in their truth. I don't know, that's where my head always goes. I'm like, I look around and I see all this preventable suffering.
Yeah.
It's preventable.
Yeah. It really is. It's an option. Pain is not an option.
Yeah.
Suffering is an option.
Yeah.
And I think most suffering stems from resistance. And so we hear sort of, well, don't resist, just accept life. And as a concept, that can be hard, right? Because how can I accept that something is not how I want it to be? And I used to think of acceptance as sitting back and saying, fine, the world is crappy, or we have crappy politicians, or someone is hurting, and I'll just accept it. But acceptance, when it's the deep acceptance, it recognizes, okay, this is what's happening. Now, how do I show up?
Mm-hmm.
It's almost like the antidote of resistance is not acceptance, it's curiosity.
Mm.
It's like, okay, how do I, because it's not complacent, right? It's incredibly active. But when our activism comes from judgment, it's weighed down by all this unnecessary baggage. And I work with a lot of nonprofits, and I can tell when the people that are engaged with them, the activists that are out there, are doing it from an unresolved wound, and from when they're doing it from their hearts. They're all well-intentioned. But some of them, and I think we live in a place where there is so much divisiveness and so much righteousness. And I want to make a distinction between trusting what feels right for you and righteousness. I can go and speak my truth. I've gone and punched people from a place of heart. Right? I'm not justifying violence, but when I've seen people fighting in the street, like I tend to go to, I've separated people and I have to punch it. Now, from one context, that's just violence. What are you talking about? Peace? What do you mean? So I guess what I'm inviting is that when we can be in that place of inner cohesion, our actions can be incredibly powerful. And
Now,
the fact that we accept someone,
okay.
yeah. See, I can think of some politicians just that tend to be on top of people's minds as far as sort of judgments, right?
Yeah. I
can recognize the part of me that I'm judging in them. And that's my first step. Like, oh, they're self-centered, egoic, immature, I could go on with words that are a lot less appropriate. But and then I go back with myself. It's like, oh, how am I sometimes self-centered and immature and egoic and chauvinistic and racist? And I can go down the list. And when I'm able to own all those things within myself and forgive myself, then I stop holding them as other. And yet I can still say, and I'm not voting for you. And not only am I not voting for you, I'm going to do everything possible so that you're not in power, using the political example. Yeah. And I think we can all connect with that type of energy as a parent, right? As a parent, your kid is holding a knife at an inappropriate age or walking on the ledge. You'll go take care of it. Now, you can go take care of it from a place of cohesion where you're acting, or you can take care of it from a place where you're screaming at your child and judging them and saying, it's the fourth time I've told you, blah, 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 blah. And that's the difference.
Yeah. Wow. So, do you have a perspective on why we're seeing so much tumult? It's a tumultuous world we're living in with, I'm just thinking, externally, forget about just Mother Nature. I mean, we're seeing climate change and just all of these things around us that make so many people feel separate from that and feel, I dare say, victimized or subject to the whims of whatever force they believe in. Is the disconnect real, or is there something else at play here?
When you say disconnect, tell me more.
Well, where I'm saying, I'll offer some of my belief system.
Please.
I think we're seeing a lot of people, as we're talking about, suffering. And I can't help but believe that those suffering people are carrying a certain vibration, if what we said earlier about frequencies is true. And I wonder if that collective consciousness of that vibration, and there are many, there aren't just two, there are lots and lots of, there's a whole spectrum of vibrations that one can align oneself to, tune oneself to, right?
Yeah, yeah,
And so if we're down here, I'm not judging, but there's sort of a scale that's a lower vibration where that's not necessarily serving people. Does that not impact some of what we see? Other words, another word I've seen is it not outpictured in the world? Because some of my, I think about when I've been in a bad mood, and I don't get many anymore, fortunately, and driving a car, and damn it, everybody's in my way, and I can't believe it, and why is this happening to me? Right? It's like I'm
yeah,
bringing this negative energy to myself because that's what
yeah,
I'm giving off.
yeah,
At least that's a correlation that I've drawn from all of this.
totally. I and I think sometimes, see, because it's not either or, right? From one perspective, it's all one, and all of it is a reflection of us and our inner state. And from another perspective, there's very real hurt out there, right? And so it's not this, or is it this, or is it this? It's the yes and. And what I do know is that I can observe life and I can assess how the information as to how I can best participate in life without carrying a lot of the other stuff that I can carry along with it, right?
Mm-hmm.
The guilt, the shame, the blame, the all of that is the unnecessary baggage. That if we can untangle that from the information, then we look at a world that's hurting and we show up in whichever way is possible. Right? Because the equivalent of a bad mood, like you're describing, where everything sort of is reflecting back that negativity, is us seeing the world as through the lens of it shouldn't be, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not talking about some spiritual sugarcoating of like, no, it's exactly as it should be, and because those are all ways in which we justify our passivity at times. It's like, no, it is how it is. No blaming, no judging, no, just I have discernment, and I'm going to show up in that way, and I'm going to do my part. Because as long as I'm sitting down, and we get so used to complaining about others' behaviors, call it government or call it peers or neighbors, but that's just incredibly disempowering, right?
It is.
So if we claim back the full ownership of how we show up and we own our stuff, right? Because everything that we're judging in someone else, if we can own that and forgive it in ourselves and themselves, then we get to show up. Then we're engaged. Then we're doing our part.
I love that. Well, I guess that kind of answers the question, or maybe you have a different answer to this question. Why should we feel hope in what at times might feel like a hopeless situation?
Sometimes I'm driving my kids around and I'm from one place to another and I'm taking meetings and I'm doing all of this and and I notice how overwhelmed I can be. And then I remember I can do a blank slate this instant.
Yeah.
I can just start from right now and be curious with what's true in this instant without the narrative that I'm carrying around in my mind. And when I'm able to do that, then I am fully where I am. I don't need to be telling myself a story of what I did or what I need to do in order to continue doing what I'm doing. I think we've given so much value to our stories. And I think that the hope, if we can connect with a hope that is not a future-based hope, is not a better story of the future, right? Because that's still operating in this realm of not here. But if we can use sort of hope as an invitation to reset and show up anew at any given moment, then we are living hope. And no matter how deep, how deviated, how off course we are, in an instant, we drop all our stories, we take responsibility for the hurt that we may have caused or whatever it is that we need to correct. But we're back here fresh. And that is such a gift.
Ooh, gift indeed. I have one last sort of request of you. And I ask this of all my guests, and that is, you just gave us some, but I want to see if you have any other words, wisdom, advice for our listeners who are just maybe a little overwhelmed during this really difficult time that we see ourselves in as an entire civilization. What would you say?
Be gentle with yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Bring all those parts inside of you that are feeling the overwhelm and make space for them. Because overwhelm doesn't need to be convinced not to be overwhelmed. Overwhelm needs to be met in its overwhelm. And we all have the capacity to embrace those parts of ourselves and say, it's okay. It's going to be okay. And I've got you. Mm-hmm. And we can do that for ourselves. And then when we do it for ourselves, we can do it for others.
I feel that deeply. And I'm envisioning a world where other people can develop this perspective for themselves. And I'm grateful that you have been able to show up, most importantly, and go on and to write a book that other people can access and model for themselves and explore for themselves, because a book can't begin to demonstrate what it means to find some of these levels of awareness. So thank you for putting it out there as a model and for being so vulnerable and bringing this whole perspective to light for so many. Thank you.
Thank you for having me, Ginny. It's such a pleasure, and thank you for what you do.
Yeah, I appreciate it. This makes it all worthwhile.
Mm.
And that, my friends, I got to go meditate on this one. That is our episode for today. We will see you next time, and thank you, Emilio Diez Barroso.